Let us venture into the bleak and perilous existence of the medieval hired killer. These were not the glamorous figures of storybooks, but desperate souls operating in the gloom. They moved through silent castle passages and filthy backstreets, altering the course of events with a single, quiet thrust. While fiction portrays them with style, the actual experience was one of profound misery. Before you settle in, if you find value in this exploration, please support the channel with a like and subscription. Share your location and the current time in your part of the world in the comments below. It is always intriguing to see our global audience. Now, lower the lights, create some ambient sound, and let us commence our exploration for this evening. Understand this clearly. No one in the Middle Ages ever aspired to this vocation. It was not a chosen profession, but a final, wretched destination for those whose lives had already collapsed. These individuals were rarely mysterious masters from hidden sects. They were typically impoverished farmers, disgraced knights, former criminals with a steady hand, or people so marginalized they could commit murder and remain unnoticed. If you possessed wealth or status, you commissioned murders, you did not carry them out. If you owned property or livestock, you were in a position to give orders. And if you were escaped from a dungeon, known for resolving disputes permanently, and could enter a tavern unseen, then you were a candidate. Someone, somewhere, was likely preparing to offer you a purse of coins and utter an ang. But Maine was never an easy target. You were not hired to eliminate a harmless farmer. Your mark was usually a corrupt noble, a wealthy cleric, or a person guarded by many men in a water miner's filled ditch. The planet was a temptation. The task was horrifying. But by this point, the recruit had nothing left to lose. No family, no prospects, and certainly no healthcare. Furthermore, the position offered no benefits, no retirement fund, no recognition, no days off. You could not advertise your services with a professional sign. Your existence depended on silence, speed, and absolute secrecy about your occupation. You could never confess your trade, especially not in a loud voice at the local inn. You would claim to be a merchant of rugs, explaining any stains as part of the dyeing process. Thus, no one aspired to this life. They were forced into it after the world had utterly broken them. You were not a hero, nor even a central antagonist. You were a frightening footnote in history, unlikely to live long enough to spend your earnings. Let us dismantle the first major misconception. Medieval killers did not train in secret temples with wise masters and inspiring music. There was no training sequence, no mentor, no motivational speech. Any skills acquired through sheer survival of initial, clumsy attempts. Most were not highly skilled professionals, but frantic novices with a good sense of direction and the ability to move quietly. Previous military experience was a bonus, meaning you knew how to grip a knife. Without it, the act of stabbing might be straightforward, but escaping afterward with your life required either talent or sheer chance. Usually, it was just luck. There were no instruction books, no guild meetings, no safety protocols. You learned how to identify a decoy or locate a noble's private exit while angling from a windowsill, wondering if you had mistakenly entered the servants' quarters again. Poisons were a field of experimentation, with a high probability of error. Sometimes the substance worked. Sometimes the target merely felt dizzy and became suspicious of his meal. Sometimes you accidentally drank the poison yourself. There was no emergency hotline for such mistakes. Only hope, guesswork with herbs, and a strong constitution. On rare occasions, you might learn something from a thief or a sellsword. Perhaps a seasoned killer showed you how to walk on cobblestones without making a sound. But such guidance was not standard. It was exceptional and brief, because experienced practitioners in this field did not retire. They simply vanished. Formal weapons training was non-existent. You did not carry a large sword. Your arsenal was a dagger stolen from a guard, perhaps a garrote if you were sophisticated, and anything else that could be concealed under your clothing without making noise. You were not a master of shadowy martial arts. You were a person with rough hands, quiet footsteps, and a deeply troubled association with narrow passageways. Success was not born from training but from survival. You learned to kill quickly, messily, and then disappear before anyone could draw your likeness and post it on the church door. Your education was brutal, practical. and offered no graduation ceremony. Only injuries, bloodstains, and the slow, chilling understanding that you were completely alone. The lure was coin, of course. Heavy, cold, and promising a reprieve from hunger. Yet the reality was a web of deceit. Those who hired your kind desired no lasting partnerships. They sought a single, silent service with no evidence left behind, including you. They promised a purse of silver, half paid in advance, the rest upon completion. But upon completion was a fluid term, meaning only after they were certain you had not failed, caused embarrassment, or survived long enough to speak of the affair. So you would do the deed, slink through darkness, risk your life, perhaps end a baron's life in his sleep. It was never clean or poetic, and upon your return, you'd find your contact had vanished, or worse, awaited you with a blade. A knife to your gut was far cheaper than a final payment. Even when payment arrived, it never felt sufficient. Not for the risk, the blood on your hands, or the days spent hiding in a flea-infested haystack with your conscience. You received a meager sum, a dismissive gesture, and the reminder you weren't ever here. Some contracts were outright deceptions, political traps. You'd be sent to eliminate a dangerous mark, only to find an ambush waiting. You had just walked into your own execution, your name already etched on the gallows, and if a client cheated you, you could not seek legal recourse. Your Honour, I wish to file a complaint against Lord Edmund for breach of our murder contract. The only court you'd see would be the one where you were the central exhibit. So you learned to take what you could get immediately, to demand full payment up front, and to trust no one. Not even the oily scribe who swore this job would change your destiny. It did, primarily by making it shorter. This life was built upon shattered promises, and your only skill became vanishing before those promises shattered you. So, you've accepted the contract, been deceived about the payment, and now likely face death. Let us discuss your equipment. Forget the tales of hidden wrist blades and enchanted daggers. Your toolkit consisted of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or conceal beneath a ragged cloak without it clinking you. If you were exceptionally fortunate, you possessed a reliable dagger, not ornate or paved, simply sharp, ideally free of rust, and not smelling of its previous owner. Poisons existed, but their use was not an elegant art. Most were unpredictable concoctions from plants, minerals, or animal parts. Some worked instantly, others took hours. Some merely made your victim vomit for 2 days before recovering angrier and deeply suspicious of his food. Ropes had their uses for climbing or strangling, but you had to be proficient. Fumbling with knots while wrestling a target was a recipe for disaster. Bows were effective, if you earned one and knew how to use it, but smuggling one into a guarded palace was nearly impossible. Most killings were intimate affairs. There was no time for careful aim, only for quick, quiet, and hopefully not overly messy work. You had no backups. If your blade bent or fell down a well, you improvised. A loose style, a rusty nail, a sharpened buckle, desperation bred invention. You hid your tools in clothing seams, boots, or even hollowed minus-out bread. You kept them close not for comfort, but because in this trade, your weapon was your only companion, your employer, and your sole pension plan. There were no upgrades, no fine minus tuning between assignments. You did not polish your gear, you prayed it would not fail you at the critical moment, because in the end, it was not the weapon that killed. It was you under-equipped, alone, and expected to perform miracles with little more than a pointed piece of metal and a desperate hunt. Your targets were never common folk. No one paid to remove a harmless candle minus maker. Your marks were the powerful nobles, bishops, military leaders, sometimes even royalty. And these people were exceedingly difficult to kill. First, there were the guards, not just a few, but dozens armed, and well minus fed. Some patrolled the front, others the rear, some simply stood as intimidating deterrents. You would spend days memorizing patrol routes, squeaky doors, and even the breathing patterns of the guard with asthma. Second, they were the fortifications. Castles lacked welcoming front porches, they possessed gatehouses, murder holes, and moats filled with biting creatures. If you avoided drowning, you still faced arrow slits and pots of boiling oil. Your job description implicitly included being set on fire for a simple misstep. Third, there were the servants, cooks, scribes, stable hands. One wrong glance from you, and they would be reporting to the guard captain faster than you could claim to be the new herbalist. You were not merely fighting soldiers, you were fighting gossip. And medieval gossip traveled with lethal speed if it meant saving one's own head. Finally, your actual target was deeply paranoid, and with good reason. They were surrounded by rivals, scheming relatives, and scores of sycophants. They employed food tasters, slept behind multiple locked doors, some in decoy beds or rotated rooms like a deadly game of musical chairs. But if you heard they were attending a feast, do not celebrate. Yes, they might be drunk, but so would you be from nerves. You still had to pass the royal guards, watchdogs, an observant jester, and 50 potential witnesses. Nearly getting close could take weeks. Posing as a servant, bribing a maid, hiding in cargo. When the man had finally arrived, you had one chance. One precise, silent, flawless moment to strike and then vanish into the night like a ghost. Failure meant becoming the next public warning, swinging from the gates with a sign that read, "Aspiring Assassin." Let us be honest. When you imagine a medieval assassin, you picture sleek black outfits and a hood flowing dramatically in the wind. The reality was that you looked like an unwell shepherd with a secret. Disguises in the Middle Ages were not high fashion. You wore whatever you could find: peasant rags, an ill-fitting monk's robe, or a stolen guard uniform that still smelled of its last owner. The goal was to blend in, which meant looking like everyone else unwashed, possibly limping, and twitchy from poor nutrition. You drew suspicion not from your clothing, but from constantly adjusting your belt to hide an dagger wrapped in cloth. Forget masks. Most facial coverings made you look like a leper, which was effective for avoiding conversation but terrible for gaining entry to any event. It questioned. You had to invent an identity on the spot. I am Brother Tobias, here for silent errand, inspecting the gutters. Even if you passed the guards, the household staff were not fools. Servants noticed new faces, especially those who mishandled common tasks or could not main the cook's bet. You were always one curious glance away from being bludgeoned with a heavy candlestick. If your disguise worked, congratulations. You now had to maintain that character for hours, pretending not to notice the very people you were there to kill. Wigs did not exist. If you needed to appear older, you smeared dirt on your face, squinted, and hoped your blood minus on beard would not loosen. The truth was, a disguise bought you perhaps 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you needed to be gone, invisible, or supremely convincing. If discovered, the outcome was grim. No one wants to be the assassin caught in a bishop's chambers wearing a nun's habit and holding a bloody knife, least of all on a holy day. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you had no team. No partner with a crossbow, no alchemist in a hidden lab, no handler offering coded messages and encouragement. You had only yourself, a rusty blade, and profound trust issues. There were no reliable guilds. Rumors of a secret brotherhood were just tavern talk, fueled by ale and boredom. You were more likely to meet a phantom than another professional killer interested in networking. This isolation was necessary. In your profession, the fewer who knew you existed, the longer you lived. Every acquaintance was a risk, every loose tongue a potential noose. Even your client likely did not know your real name, and if they did, you were already planning your escape. Companionship was a joke. Friends asked questions, lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and why you slept with a knife under your pillow. You could not settle down. You dared not. One mistake, one recognition in a marketplace, and your life became a frantic dash for the nearest sewer drain. Even other criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were social creatures. You were the one who made people disappear. They feared you, or worse, saw you as a liability. No one wanted to share a meal with someone whose profession could attract an angry mob with torches, and you could expect no sympathy. You could not speak of the sleepless nights after silently dispatching a corrupt bishop. If you spoke of your work, people assumed you were either lying or monstrous, and they were not wrong. So you kept your secrets, your scars, and your weapons to yourself. At the inn, you sat in the darkest corner, your back to the wall, eyes always on the door. You never drank too much. You never stayed more than one night. You never gave your name unless paid first, and even then, it was likely an alias. Being a medieval assassin meant perfecting the art of disappearance, not just from a crowd, but from any semblance of a moral life you might have desired. Let us say you took the job, planned your approach, bribed the right official, and disguised yourself as a convincing tradesman, and then you froze. Perhaps the target turned around unexpectedly. Perhaps they were with a child. Perhaps your hand trembled at the worst possible moment. In that case, you were already dead, because failure for a medieval assassin was not a written warning. It was a public, agonizing, and theatrical death, often involving ropes, fire, wheels, or iron devices with names like the Bone Cracker. Missing the kill meant the entire operation was exposed. Your target lived and immediately alerted everyone of the attempt. Suddenly, you were not a shadowy figure, but a wanted man with your description on every tavern wall within 30 miles. The guards you once evaded were now highly motivated. Sometimes the greater threat was not your target, but your client. If you failed, you were no longer an asset but a liability, someone who could be captured, tortured, and forced to talk. The very people who hired you would be the first to place a new contract on your life. There were no second chances. No apologizing for a slipped blade and promising to try again tomorrow. You had one opportunity, one moment in time. If you failed, the best outcome was a quick death before your captors discovered who hired you. Failure also meant a silent, humiliating shame. You had failed to be invisible. You had failed to be perfect, and for an assassin, perfection was synonymous with survival. Anything less was like painting a target on your back and rehearsing your final words. It did not matter how many previous jobs had succeeded. In this profession, you were only as good as your last kill, and if your last kill never happened, your only remaining task was to run. So you succeeded. The plan worked. The blade found its mark. No alarm was raised, a powerful figure was no more. Congratulations. Now you must flee for your life. Because success in medieval assassination did not mean enjoying a drink on a rooftop with a city burning picturesquely behind you. It meant sprinting through back alleys with blood on your boots and hounds already on your trail. There was no victory celebration, no post-minus mission drink with colleagues, no calm debriefing with your employer. You did not even have a moment to admire your work. The instant your strike landed, your new objective was to escape everyone who now wanted you dead in creatively brutal ways. Guards were coming, doors were being locked, and your horse was tied on the other side of town. You were likely injured. You had to plan your escape route before the kill paths, alternate disguises, potential safe houses, perhaps a boatman who owed you a favor or at least knew not to ask questions. The city would be locked down within minutes. No one wanted a scandal, and lockdown meant sealed gates, armed checkpoints, and scores of angry men who had just received your description labeled armed and extremely dangerous. And let us consider the client. Assuming they intended to pay, they would not meet you at a cozy tavern with gratitude. They would likely disappear too, because a successful assassin was the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You had proven you could penetrate heady security, so even in success, you walked away with coins in one hand and a massive target on your back. What did you truly win? A week of sleeping in barns, bribing furry men, shaving in the dark, and pretending to be a pilgrim named Brother Lucian. Success did not guarantee survival. It meant starting the entire grind game over in a new city, under a new name, with even more people hunting you. So yes, you completed the kill. Now run as if hell itself is at your heels. If the misery of the role were not enough, the poverty, the constant fear, the accommodations that smelled of livestock, you also faced the wildly inventive paranoia of the populace. In the Middle Ages, assassins were not merely feared, they were considered cursed, unholy. To the average peasant, you were not just a killer in a hood. You were a creature who consulted with demons and anointed your blade with frogs under a full moon. How else could you bypass guards and vanish into darkness? Logic was not prevalent, but superstition was everywhere. Some believed assassins could change shape. Others claimed you were invisible unless doused in holy water. A popular story suggested you made pacts with forest spirits and could till through walls. Imagine walking through a village and hearing a woman whisper, "Do not look at him. He might curse the children." Even your tools were suspect. A simple dagger was clearly forged in accursed fire. The use of poison was not chemistry, it was witchcraft, presumably stirred with a severed toe under a blood moon. You might think this fear would be an advantage, that people would avoid you. The reality was worse. A superstitious mob does not hesitate. They do not ask questions. They throw stones, light fires, and shout, "Burn him before he summons lightning." Your reputation made people overreact. The minute someone died unexpectedly from illness, an accident, choking on food, someone would whisper, "Perhaps it was a shadow minus man." Perhaps it was him. You could be hunted merely for being in the same village as a suspicious death. This meant you had to keep moving. Always. Remain too long, and suddenly a priest is ringing a bell while 5 furious farmers advance with pitchforks as if this were their destiny. And heaven help you if you were found with anything unusual, dried herbs. For uncoins, even just a strange accent. That was all it took for someone to cry sorcerer and light a torch. In a world that believed monsters wore human faces, being too quiet, too clever, or too swift marked you as a threat. Then by medieval reasoning, threats required swift elimination, preferably by fire. Consider poison, the assassin's theoretical to love elegance. A quiet death, no mess, no screaming, just a sip, a stagger, and it is done. That is the theory. In practice, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a duel with herbal tea and a poor rectitude. First, poisons were unreliable. You had no access to refined toxins or neat pills labeled swift demise. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, maybe a toad secretion. You gathered, ground, and hoped. Even then, it might only give the target a stomachache and a renewed dedication to his security detail. There was no precise measurement. You estimated. A bit too little. And the noble merely vomits and cancels his dinner. Ate it too much, and you are dead from handling the substance before the first course is served. Furthermore, the medieval kitchens were chaotic. You could not simply stroll and unseason the soup with nightshade. You had to bribe or impersonate a cook, sneak in unseen, or, most perilously, try to poison a meal that would be tested by 3 tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your victim was a noble, they did not simply eat, they treated meals like a military operation. Food was tasted blessed and sniffed by everyone from the steward to the court jester. By the time it reached the plate, it had passed through more security than a royal crown. Even if you succeeded in administering the poison undetected and the target consumed it, the result was wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took hours, some days. One moment your mark is laughing, the next he is clutching his stomach and demanding his astrologer. And if he survived, guess who he would blame? Not the cook, not the taster. You, the quiet individual with knowledge of herbs and nervous eyes. So poisoning was not efficient. It was risky, slow, and full of variables, none in your favor, and if caught, you did not receive a quick death. You were interrogated with tools until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the Duke to his hounds. You might think that if you successfully altered history by removing a tyrant, disrupting a royal line, or silencing a political threat, someone would remember your name. No. You were an assassin. Your name was never meant to be remembered. At best, you were a rumor. A hooded figure, a foreigner with cold eyes, the quiet man who left his ale unfinished. You could have pulled off the most legendary assassination of the century and still be recorded as a mysterious death in the official chronicles. In fact, that was the objective. Your client did not want a story, they wanted plausible deniability. The fewer who knew the perpetrator, the safer they were from ending up poisoned by their own hired blade. So your name was buried the moment the job was done, If you ever used your real one, you did not sign your work. You did not boast. You did not keep trophies. You did not exist outside that single, lethal moment. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. And in your profession, loose ends had a very short lifespan. Forget honor. There were no medals for silence. No monuments for the man who prevented a war with one dagger thrust in the night. If a noble desired a statue, he commissioned one of himself. You received a wooden coffin, an unmarked grave, or if things went poorly, a head on a spike labeled traitor. Sometimes your name was remembered only to be cursed. You became a whispered cautionary tale. Do not cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Alaric? Yes, and the man who did it. Gone, like a ghost. That was your legacy. Not fame, not fear, but absence. You were not meant to leave a mark. You were meant to vanish. And if you remained known for too long, that was a fatal error, because in the medieval world, heroes were remembered. Assassins were erased. So you survived. You completed the task. You even managed to get paid, a miracle in itself. Now, all you must do is lie low, remain inconspicuous, and trust that your employer will honor the agreement and protect your identity. Correct? Incorrect. Because in the world of medieval assassination, one rule surpassed all others: never trust anyone, especially the person who pays you. Your client, whether a noble, merchant, or ambitious bishop with flexible morals, did not hire you out of respect. They hired you because they required a terrible deed done, and you were the sharpest instrument available in the shadows. Once the task was complete, you became a liability. You knew too much who wanted whom, Deb, when, why, and the price they were willing to pay. That made you dangerous not only to their enemies but to them. So what did they do? They vanished. They denied ever meeting you. Or worse, they sent another killer to clean up, to finalize the contract with something sharper than a pen. There were even instances of clients double-minus booking, hiring one assassin for the job and another to eliminate the first immediately after. No refunds, just reduced risk. And if you dared attempt blackmail, if you threatened to expose them, that was a bold and final mistake. Powerful individuals in the Middle Ages did not negotiate with assassins. They crushed them. If your client possessed a shred of honor or a rare quality, indeed you might be paid and left alone. But even then, you had to assume you were being watched from a distance, with someone already sharpening a blade and memorizing your gait. You were the secret that could not be allowed to speak, the shadow that could not linger. Even success could not turn rust, because in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again. Then no one, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be next. Let us imagine you somehow beat the odds. You survived the killings, the deceit, the poisonings, the betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and likely your own morality. Now what? You retire? Absolutely not. In medieval times, assassins did not have retirement plans. There were no farewell banquets, no quiet cottages by the sea, no pensions paid in gold by a grateful kingdom. You did not fade into a peaceful old age. You vanished, or you died, often both. The problem was simple: you weren't ever safe. Even if you abandoned the profession, your past did not. You carried too many secrets, too many names, too much blood on your hands. People did not want you retired, they wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried. And even if no one actively pursued you, insignificant, if you lived with the constant dread that someone might, that a young, eager assassin, looking to make his name, had just received a contract for the shadowy figure who used to be someone dangerous. So you changed your name again. You moved to a village where no one asked questions. You feigned a limp, sold herbs, claimed you were a former guard. But even then, you slept poorly. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. You kept your dagger under a floorboard next to the purse of coins you never spent, as it still seemed to carry the scent of the man you earned it from, and you could not trust yourself. Years of silent killings and frantic escapes had altered your mind. Every knock at the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might recognize you. You stopped dreaming because dreams were dangerous. You could not love. You could not relax. You could not laugh too loudly. You lived as a ghost pretending to be a man. The truth was, there was no endgame for a medieval assassin. Only a slow, cold fade into obscurity, always moving, always watching until one day you slipped into the darkness and no one noticed. Perhaps that was the most you could ever hope for. By now the reality should be clear. Being a medieval assassin was not a darkly romantic fantasy. It was not noble. It was not even particularly profitable. It was a grim, thankless, and short-minded lived existence, shrouded in blood-stained linen and pursued by a world that wanted you dead. You would not have lasted not a week, perhaps not even a single day, because you would have begun with incorrect assumptions. You would believe yourself to be sleek and in control, a whisper in the dark. But in truth, you would be cold, hungry, and one poor decision away from the gallows. You would arrive in a town, cloak drawn tight, ready for action, only to discover your target had relocated. The guards were drunk but alert, and the stable boy you bribed had already betrayed you for a mug of ale. You would freeze at the wrong instant, stab the wrong person, be spotted by a maid who once saw your face near the chapel. Suddenly, you are not a shadow, you are the problem. Then what? You run. But you are unaccustomed to the terrain, the mud, the uneven streets, the astonishing number of stray animals. You slip, fall, and are captured by a guard named Thomas who just had his heart broken and is seeking an outlet. Suppose you survive that. Then you face the aftermath, no allies, no honor, no future. Only whispers, suspicion, and the growing realization that even if you succeeded, the best you could hope for was to die old and alone, hiding behind a false name in a village that still believed in fairies. So no, you would not have lasted, and frankly, you should not have tried. The assassin's life was not cool. It was a cruel mechanism that consumed people and left behind only shadows. It offered power without peace, purpose without a place in the world. You did not shape history, you erased yourself from it. And the only thing awaiting you at the end was silence. Say silence. No one would question, because no one even remembered you were there to begin with. You were a ghost in the ledger, a debt paid not in coin, but in oblivion. The true currency of this shadow trade was not silver, but desperation. A man would not risk such horrors for mere wealth alone. He did so when all other doors had slammed shut. This was not a path chosen from ambition, for it once stumbled upon, when the abyss was the only vista left. Consider the recruitment. You were not sought out in a tavern with a discreet tap on the shoulder. More often, you found your way to the work for a chain of grim referrals, cast like a secret between those who had nothing left to lose. A former soldier, cast out from his lord's service for a minor disgrace, might be pointed toward a certain disreputable scribe. A peasant whose family had starved after a lord's taxes seized his harvest might be given a name by a sympathetic innkeeper who knew of darker solutions. The interview was not a conversation. It was an assessment. Can you hold a blade without your hand shaking? Can you follow simple instructions? Can you keep your mouth permanently shut? There were no tests of skill, only evaluations of your disparand, your discretans. Your first job was never a nobleman. It was a merchant who had cheated the wrong person, a local bailiff known for his brutality. A task meant to test your mettle and your loyalty. The payment was small, the risk immense, but the alternative, returning to the starvation and hopelessness that drove you here, was worse. This was the great, transparent roof of the medieval assassin. He was a product of a system that had already discarded him. He was the human refuse of feudalism, sharpened into a point and aimed back at the very structure that created him. The psychology of the kill was a territory far more complex than the physical act. To take a life, not in the heat of battle, but in cold, premeditated silence, carved fissures into a man's soul. There was no glory, no adrenaline minus fueled rush. There was only the terrible, intimate proximity to another human's final moment, the sound of a last, gurgling breath, the feel of a life departing under your hands, the sight of eyes widening in shock, then glazing over into nothing. Some turned to drink to silence the memories, a dangerous indulgence in a profession that demanded constant vigilance. Others retreated into a profound, catatonic silence. Their humanity scoured away layer by layer with each drug. They developed rituals, a prayer to a forgotten god before the act, a specific way of cleaning the blade afterward, a compulsive need to wash their hands, over and over, as if they could ever be truly clean. Sleep was a foreign country. Dreams were populated with the faces of the dead. They would startle awake at the slightest noise, hand already gripping the dagger under their pillow. The line between hunter and prey was perpetually thin, and, in their dreams, they were always the prey. This internal erosion was the true cost of the profession, far exceeding the danger of capture. You sold not just your labor, but your peace, your sanity, your very self. You became a walking ghost, haunted by the lives you had extinguished. Beyond the walls of castles and the scheming of nobles, there existed a whole other theatre for this dark trade, the world of commerce and the church. A rival merchant, seeking to eliminate competition, might pay to have a warehouse burned down, with the owner inside. A master craftsman, threatened by a more talented newcomer, might decide that an accident with a tool was a sound investment. The church, despite its heavenly aspirations, was oft knee-minus deep in earthly politics. A bishop aiming for a cardinal's hat might find that a rival's sudden, mysterious illness cleared his path, and the Gnostic order, in a dispute over land, might discover that the opposing abbot had a fatal allergy to a certain herb, conveniently introduced into his meal. These killings were often even more treacherous than political assassinations. The clients were businessmen, accustomed to seeing people as assets and liabilities. An assassin who became a liability himself would be liquidated with the same cold efficiency as a bad investment. Ecclesiastical clients were the most dangerous of all. They believed their cause was divinely justified, and that any sin committed in its pursuit could be absolved. Killing the instrument of that sin, the assassin, was not a crime. It was a form of spiritual housekeeping. In these spheres, the assassin was not a shadowy figure of legend, but a mere tool, a temporary and disposable solution to a mundane problem of profit or power. What of the women in this profession? History is largely silent, but silence does not mean absence. A woman could move through spaces a man could not. She could enter a noble's chamber as a serving girl, the laundress, or a purported healer. She could carry poison in a vial of perfume or a jar of salve. A thin, sharp needle, dipped in poison and hidden in her hair, could deliver a kill in a crowded room that looked like a sudden fainting spell. Her disguises worm or seamless. She was a seamstress, a milkmaid, a pilgrim. Her weapons were the tools of her domestic trade, a knitting needle, a kitchen knife, the poisoned pin. The risks, however, were multiplied. If suspected, she faced not only execution but torture and violation beforehand. Her motives were often more visceral than coin. Vengeance for a slain family, justice for a violated daughter, a desperate act to protect her children from a predatory lord. She was the most invisible of assassins, her story the most thoroughly erased, and perhaps, for that reason, the most deadly. In the end, the medieval assassin was a paradox. He was a weapon of the powerful, yet born from the powerless. He could change the course of history with a single stroke, yet was himself a historical non-minus entity. He was a creature of his time, a symptom of a society built on violence, hierarchy, and desperation. The castle walls, the moats, the bodyguards, they were all testaments to the fear he inspired, the acknowledgement that power was always vulnerable to the determined, the desperate, and the invisible. His legacy is not in the history books, but in the paranoia that shaped fortifications, in the security measures of the powerful, and in the enduring human understanding that sometimes the greatest threats are not armies on the horizon, but the silent, solitary figure already within the walls. He is a reminder that throughout history, alongside the grand narratives of kings and empires, there has always existed an archer, quieter care and take almost of blood and shadows, where lusts were raided for coin, and souls were the ultimate, and a canoed lead cost. The very geography of a medieval city was a testament to the fear of the silent blade. Narrow, winding streets weren't just chaotic planning, they were a defensive labyrinth against armies, but a perfect hunting ground for the single, determined individual. The ever-hanging upper stories of houses created a perpetual twilight at street level, a world of deep shadows and sudden sharp corners. The constant, overwhelming stench of offal and human waste was not just a fact of life, it was a cloak, masking other, More suspicious odors, the coppery tan of blood, the scent of a stranger who didn't belong. This environment was the assassin's true element. He knew the city not as a map of streets, but as a vertical and subterranean network. He moved across rooftops, his calloused feet finding purchase on thatched roofs and uneven tiles. He navigated the jettisoned gables, the structural overhangs, using them as bridges between buildings. A misplaced tile, a loose board, these were his secret passages, known only to those who lived in spaces between the city's official pathways. Below, the streets were a different kind of maze. He knew which alley was a dead end, which apparently solid wall had a loose stone leading to a hidden courtyard. He knew the sewer channels, the kennels that ran down the center of streets, not just as obstacles, but as potential routes of escape or concealment. He could disappear into a doorway, melt into a passing procession of monks, or slip into the steam-filled interior of a bathish with ease. The city's chaos was his order. The citizen's fear of dark alleys was his assurance of privacy. His relationship with the legitimate underworld, the thieves, cut purses, and smugglers, was one of cautious, mutual exploitation. They knew of him, or knew of his kind. They might provide information for a price: the schedule of the night watch, the layout of a merchant's house, the name of a able guard. But this was a transaction, not an alliance. They feared him. His work was of a different, more final order than theirs. A thief took property, an assassin took lives, and with it attracted a level of retribution that could see a whole neighborhood put to the sword. To be associated with him was to court annihilation. So while they might sell him information, they would never offer him shelter. He was a plague carrier, and they knew to keep their distance. The tools of his trade evolved not from a blacksmith's forge, but from the mundane world, perverted to a deadly purpose. A simple bodkin needle, used by every tailor and seamstress, could be driven deep into an ear or the soft tissue under the jaw. A dowel-lock dagger, common and unremarkable in appearance, was perfectly designed for an upward thrust under the ribs. See ultra PS for minus-pointed metal spikes, could be scattered behind him in a chase, disabling pursuers' horses, or piercing the thin soles of their boots. He was a master of improvisation. A heavy pomander ball, filled with sweet herbs to ward off disease, could be filled with lead shot and used as a coach. A pilgrim's staff could conceal a thin, deadly blade within its shaft. Even the humble trencher, the stale bread used as a plate, could be sharpened on a stone and, in the hands of a desperate man, open a vein. His knowledge extended to the natural world. He knew which fungi could induce a sleeping stupor when sprinkled on a campfire, and which could cause agonizing death in a stew. He knew how to extract irritants from plants to temporarily blind a dog, or how to use certain mosses to muffle the sound of a footstep or the closing of a door. This was not alchemy, it was the bitter, practical wisdom of the woods and fields, turned to a darker purpose. The aftermath of a successful kill was a period of even greater peril than the act itself. The hue and cry would be raised, a legal obligation for all citizens to drop what they were doing and join the pursuit of a felon. The city gates would slam shut. The watch would be doubled. Every stranger would be viewed with suspicion. His escape was a meticulously planned operation in itself. He had bolt holes prepared, a forgotten cellar, a space in a belt hour, the attic of the abandoned building. He had clean clothing stashed there, allowing him to change his appearance entirely from a travel minus-stained cloak to the garb of a humble furrow or a prosperous merchant. He had pre-minus arranged signals with a ferryman on the river, a certain lantern in a window, a piece of cloth tied to a post that would summon a boat for a nocturnal, silent passage beyond the walls. Sometimes the best hiding place was in plain sight. He might join the very mob searching for him, shouting curses at the unknown killer, his face concealed in the press of bodies and the flickering torchlight. He might seek sanctuary in a church, though this was a temporary and risky refuge, as the authorities could place a guard around the building, racing for him to starve or make a mistake. The psychological toll of this constant flight was immense. He lived in a state of hyper-minus vigilance, where every slamming shutter was a threat, every glance in his direction a potential accusation. He trusted no one, relied on no one, and could form no attachments. He was a phantom, and the moment he tried to become solid, to put down roots, was the moment he would be caught. This was the ultimate truth of the medieval assassin's existence. He was not a figure of power, but of absolute isolation. He was a weapon that, once used, was discarded by the hand that wielded him and hunted by the world he had struck. His life was a continuous, silent scream in the midst of the bustling medieval world, a scream that nobody heard and that ended, always, in the same way, alone in the dark and forgotten. The hunt for a failed assassin was a relentless, organized pursuit, fueled by the outrage of the powerful. Every resource of the state and the offended noble house would be mobilized to find him. Hounds would be set upon his trail, their baying echoing through the forest as they followed the scent of fear. Roads would be blocked by checkpoints manned by grim minus-faced soldiers who asked pointed questions. A description of his face, his clothing, any distinguishing marks, would be circulated to every town and village. A price would be placed on his head, tempting even the most honest peasant with the promise of wealth for betrayal. His image, crudely sketched on parchment, would be nailed to church doors and tavern walls, a public shaming before the capture. He could trust no one, for the reward money turned every stranger into a potential informant. Former contacts would deny knowing him, fearful of being implicated in the crime. The wilderness, often a refuge for outlaws, offered little solace, as gamekeepers and foresters were enlisted to watch for any sign of him. He moved only by night, sleeping in ditches and hollow trees, his stomach gnawing by hunger and paranoia. Every snapped twig, every distant shout, sent a jolt of terror through his weary body. The world itself seemed to contract around him, every shadow holding a potential enemy, every friendly face a mask for treachery. This existence was a slow, grinding torture, a prelude to the certain, brutal death that awaited him. Capture was not a matter of if, but when, and the manner of it was often as violent as the acts he committed. When finally cornered, there was no noble last stand, only a desperate, futile struggle against overwhelming force. He might be dragged from a barn loft, pulled from a river, or surrounded in a narrow alley. His resistance was met with clubs and fists, a beating designed to subdue, not to kill, for death was too merciful an end. He was a prize, and his captors needed him alive for the spectacle of justice to come. Thrown into a dungeon, he would await his fate in the cold, damp dock, surrounded by the moans of other lost souls. His cell was a stone box, devoid of light or comfort, a physical manifestation of his internal desolation. Here, in the silence, he had nothing but his memories for company, the faces of his victims haunting his waking hours and his dreams. Interrogation was a certainty, a process designed to extract every detail of the plot and his employers. They used methods refined over centuries to break a man's body and will. The rack would stretch his joints until they popped. The Iron Maiden promised piercing agony, and Thumb's bruise crushed the very bones he used to hold his tools. The goal was not just a confession, but names, the unraveling of the entire conspiracy. Pain became his universe, a white minus hot fire that consumed all thought except the need for it to stop. Many broke, babbling everything they knew, implicating anyone they had ever met, in a desperate bid for a quicker death. Yet even this betrayal offered no salvation, for his fate was already sealed by the nature of his crime. A trial, if it occurred, was a swift and perfunctory affair, a public ritual to legitimize the violence to come. He stood before his judges, a broken figure, often unable to stand from his injuries. The charges were read, the evidence presented, and the verdict was never in doubt. He was a murderer, a creature outside the law, and the sentence was always death. The method of execution was chosen for its symbolic value and its power to deter others. Hanging was common, a public spectacle where he would dance at the end of a rope before a jeering crowd. For crimes against nobility, more creative ends were devised: beheading for a semblance of honor, burning for heresy, or drawing and quartering for treason. In his final moments, surrounded by a hostile mob, he was utterly alone. No friends, no family, no comrades came to mourn him. His death was a lesson, a gruesome entertainment that reinforced the power of the ruling class. His body or its parts would be displayed in prominent places as a warning to any who might follow his path. His head might be placed on a spike atop the city gate, his limbs sent to different towns. In death, as in life, he was abject, a tool used to maintain order through fear, and thus The cycle was complete from desperate obscurity to a brief, shadowy notoriety, and finally to a grotesque public display. His name, if it was ever known, was cast and then forgotten, erased from memory as thoroughly as he had erased others. The world moved on, the powerful secured their positions, and the only legacy of the medieval assassin was a momentary shudder in the collective conscience, a dark fairy tale to frighten children into obedience. The very concept of a guild or brotherhood of assassins is largely a romantic fiction, the comforting lies lulled by bards and storytellers to make sense of a fundamentally solitary and anarchic trade. In reality, organization was a liability. A guild kept records, had meetings, and collected dues. It created a chain of knowledge that could be followed, a web of connections that could be unraveled under torture. The truth was far more fragmented and bleak. What existed were loose, transient networks of individuals connected by mutual desperation, not oaths. A fence who moved stolen goods might know a corrupt guardsman who knew a disgraced alchemist who could procure poisons. A river pilot who smuggled contraband might also, for a higher price, ferry a person to a secluded spot downstream from a castle. These were not colleagues, they were and owned in a temporary, functional circuit, assembled for a specific purpose and dissolved immediately after. Trust was not a bond, it was a calculated risk, and the calculation was always tilted toward betrayal. The master-minus-apprentice model was equally rare and fraught with peril. Why would a seasoned killer, who had survived by trusting no one, take on a talkative, clumsy youth? The risks were astronomical. The apprentice could betray him for a reward, could botch a job and get them both killed, or could simply learn the trade and become a rival. On the rare occasion such a relationship formed, it was usually one of brutal pragmatism, not mentorship. A master used the apprentice as a lookout, a pack mule, a disposable tool to test for traps or to create a diversion. The education was delivered through curt commands and savage criticism. The apprentice learned by observing, by failing, and by suffering the consequences. Survival was the only diploma. The mythology of the Assassin's Creed with its rules against harming the innocent or maintaining a code of honor is a modern invention, a projection of our desire for moral order onto a historically immoral reality. The medieval assassin had no code but survival and payment. A witness was a liability, whether a noble lord or a scullery maid. If a child stumbled upon the scene, the child would likely share the same fate as the target. The notion of collateral damage did not exist. There was only witness elimination. The morality was the morality of the cornered rat. Do whatever it takes to live and get the cheese. Their relationship with religion was complex and deeply cynical. Most were nominally Christian, but their faith was a hollow shell. They saw the hypocrisy of the clergy firsthand, often being hired by them. They performed acts that guaranteed damnation according to any church doctrine. Some developed a twisted, personal spirituality, bargaining with a God they believed had already abandoned them. They might pray to Street Jude, the patron saint of lost causes, before a job, relieve a coin at a roadside shrine not for absolution, but as a transcational bid for luck. For them, God was not a source of mercy, but another potential client, or a celestial guardsman who might be bribed or avoided. The physical toll of the life was immense and is often overlooked. This was not the live, acrobatic figure of fantasy. This was a person whose body was a record of his profession. His hands were calloused and scarred, his knuckles often broken and poorly set. His posture was hunched from years of sleeping in cramped, cold spaces. He was likely missing teeth, not from a fight, but from malnutrition and rot. His body was a map of old injuries. A limp from a twisted ankle jumped from a wall, a shoulder that ached in the damp from an old dislocation, the network of fine scars from close calls with blades and claws. He was probably infested with lice and fleas, his skin marked by sores and rashes from exposure and poor hygiene. The romantic, shadowy figure vanishes when you imagine the smell of unwashed body, old blood, and fear that clung to him. He suffered from chronic illnesses, lung ailments from breathing the damp air of cellars and forests, fevers caught from sleeping in the rain, infections from minor cuts that festered in the filth. There were no doctors for him, only risky encounters with barber-minus surgeons who asked too many questions, or herbalists whose remedies were as likely to kill as to cure. His life was not just violent, it was unhealthy in a slow, grinding way that wore him down long before a guard's sword ever could. In the end, the greatest enemy of the medievalist assassin was not the law or the guards, or his clients. It was time itself. Each year that passed made his reflexes a fraction slower, his bones a little more brittle, his senses slightly less sharp. He could not retire. The past always had a way of catching up. He could not save his money. It was spent on survival or lost to betrayal. He was trapped in a profession with an expiration date, and that date was invariably short. The final portrait is not of a hero or a villain, but of a broken, lonely, diseased animal, waiting in the dark for a death that was, in its own way, a form of release. Each season presented its own unique catalogue of miseries for the man who lived in the shadows. In spring, the thawing ground became a quagmire that clung to his boots and betrayed his passage with deep, clear prints. The lengthening days offered fewer hours of protective darkness in which to operate. Eyes were everywhere, enjoying the milder weather, making anonymity a fleeting commodity. Summer brought sweltering heat that made his leather garments a sticky, suffocating prison. The stench of the city intensified, a visible haze of rotten decay that clawed at the throat. Flies swarmed in thick clouds, drawn to the sweat and grime that caked his skin. Sleep was impossible in the stifling heat, leaving him perpetually exhausted and on edge. He was at constant risk of dehydration and fever, with no one to bring him water or cool his brow. Autumn was a season of falling leaves that crackled like warning bells underfoot. The once dense foliage that had concealed his movements now withered, exposing him. Early frosts bit at his fingers, stiffening his joints and slowing his draw. Harvest festivals filled the streets with drunken revelers, any one of whom might accidentally stumble upon his hiding place. Winter was the most brutal master of all, a season of pure, unadulterated agony. Bone-minus chilling cold seeped through the thinnest clothing, promising a slow death by exposure. His breath hung in the air like a ghostly signal, betraying his presence in the silent night. Stable and barn, potential refuges, were guarded more fiercely against the desperate and the frozen. Every surface was slick with ice, turning a simple rooftop crossing into a deadly gamble. Food was scarcest then the hunger was a constant, gnawing companion in the cold. He was a creature of the elements, forever at war with a world that sought to break him through whether a line. His finances were a desperate cycle of feast and famine, dictated by the winds of word. A single successful contract might bring a handful of silver, seeming like a king's ransom. This wealth was illusory, for it had to fund his entire existence until the next uncertain job. He immediately faced a series of unavoidable, draining expenses just to continue existing. A new cloak was needed when the old one became threadbare and recognizable. It required constant repair from miles of walking on rough, unforgiving ground. Weapons needed sharpening, replacing, or disguising, each service costing precious coin. He had to pay for information, for bribes, for a night's shelter in a foul minor-smelling helloft. Food and drink, even of the poorest quality, steadily consumed his funds. Medical aid for an injury or illness could wipe out an entire payment in one go, and money vanished with terrifying speed, leaving him once again on the brink of destitution. This constant financial pressure often drove him to take reckless, poorly paid jobs out of pure necessity. He was trapped in an economic prison, where the price of survival was perpetual service to the shadows. His mind, over time, became his own worst enemy, a landscape of paranoia and twisted memories. He saw the faces of the dead in the grain of wood, in the patterns of flowing water. He started at the sound of his own heartbeat in the silence of the night. Ordinary conversations were passed for hidden meanings and subtle threats that worked there. Sleep, when it came, was not restful, but a theatre for replaying his worst moments. He would wake gasping, clutching his dagger, having dreamed of the guard he strangled years prior. The line between memory and present reality began to blur in dangerous ways. A merchant's casual glance in the market felt like the accusatory stare of a magistrate. He developed rituals and superstitions to impose order on his chaotic existence. He would count his steps, touch a doorway 3 times, or arrange his meager belongings in a precise pattern. To deviate from these rituals felt like inviting catastrophe, a sign of impending capture. His internal monologue was a continuous, low-grade hum of suspicion and fear. He trusted no one, not the baker who sold him bread, nor the child who smiled at him in the street. This isolation was a self-perpetuating cycle. For his erratic behavior pushed away any who might have shown kindness. He was a man slowly being devoured from the inside by the very acts that kept him alive. In the end, the story of the medieval assassin is not one of skill or intrigue, but of erosion. It is the story of a human soul being weathered away, layer by layer, by wind, rain, and blood. He began as a man, perhaps with a name, a family, a past however troubled. The profession first took his identity, forcing him to become a series of lies and aliases. It then took his body, breaking it down with fatigue, injury, and perpetual discomfort. It took his peace, replacing it with a constant, screaming vigilance that never ceased. It took his morality, until the act of killing became as mundane as drawing breath. Finally, it took his mind, leaving behind a hollowed minus-out shell, a creature of pure reaction and fear. He did not die a hero's death, celebrated in song and story. He died in a ditch, feverish and alone, his final sight the uncaring stars. For he died on the executioner's block, his last sound the jeers of a crowd that never knew his name. For he simply disappeared, his body food for rats and worms, his story forever untold. His existence was a brief, dark spark in the long night of history, extinguished without a trace. He was a tool, used and discarded, a grim testament to the brutal calculus of power and desperation. And in the grand tapestry of the medieval world, he was the frayed, invisible thread that held nothing together but its own misery. The moon was both his ally and his accuser, casting just enough light to navigate, but also threatening to expose his silhouette against the cobblestones. He moved with the patience of a glacier, each step placed with deliberate care to avoid the telltale crunch of gravel. His world was painted in shades of grey and black, his eyes long adjusted to the minimal light of a sliver moon or a distant torch. Time itself was measured differently for him, not in hours but in the changing of the guard, the extinguishing of household candles, the barking of a dog finally falling silent. He knew the sound of every nocturnal creature, using the scuttle of a rat or the hoot of an owl to mask his own slight noises. His senses were perpetually heightened, his hearing so acute he could discern the rustle of a guard's cloak from the sigh of the wind. He could smell the oil on a newly polished sword blade, the lingering scent of perfume on a nobleman's discarded glove, the damp stone of a forgotten crypt. His touch could read the texture of a wall, finding the almost imperceptible cracks that might offer a finger-hold for a desperate climb. His own body was a tool to be disciplined, his breath controlled to a shallow, silent rhythm, his heartbeat willed to slow despite the adrenaline. He became a student of human weakness, observing the patterns of boredom, drunkenness, and inattention that created his opportunities. He knew which guards would doze at their posts, which servants would sneak away for a tryst, which merchants would leave a window unbarred for a breeze. He exploited the rhythms of complacency, the universal human tendency to believe that the familiar is safe. His greatest weapon was not the dagger at his belt, but his profound understanding of the mundane. He could wait for hours motionless, in a space most men would find unbearably cramped or cold. His mind would enter a state of focused emptiness, a kind of waking sleep where only the tide and the path to it existed. His trance-like concentration was the only peace he ever knew, a brief respite from the constant churn of fear and memory. In these moments, he was not a man but a function, a purpose, a living weapon poised to strike. The approach was a slow, liquid dance, a merging with the shadows, a becoming of the night itself. He was the ripple in the darkness that had no source, the chill that was attributed to a draught. He was the creak in the floorboards that the household dismissed as the old house settling. He was nothing, and then, for one terrible, decisive moment, he was everything. The act itself was swift, brutal, and profoundly intimate, a violation of personal space that ended all space. It was a grapple in the dark, a hand over a mouth, the brief, fierce struggle of life against the inevitable. There was no ceremony, no speech, no last words granted or received. It was a transaction of force, a transfer of momentum from a living body to a dying one, and then just as quickly he was gone, retreating back into the nothingness from which he came. The return journey was often the most dangerous. His energy spent, his focus fractured by the deed just done. He had to navigate the same perils, but now with the scent of blood possibly on his clothes, and the ghost of the act in his eyes. He would often take a circuitous route, doubling back, wading through streams, anything to break his trail and confuse any pursuit. His safe house was never truly safe, just the least unsafe option available: a root cellar, a church crypt, a leper's abandoned hut. Here in the absolute dark, he would finally allow himself to tremble, the aftershocks of the violence coursing through his body. He would check his clothing for stains, his weapons for damage, his person for any unnoticed wounds. The coins, when he received them, felt cold and heady, their metallic scent unable to mask the phantom smell of iron and death. He would count them not with greed, but with a grim accounting of how many days of life they purchased. This was the cycle: the wait, the strike, the flight, the tremble in the dark, the count of coins. It was a wheel that turned relentlessly, each revolution grinding away another piece of his humanity. He was a ghost in the machine of feudal society, a flaw in the architecture of power, a reminder that every wall has a crack. And though his name is lost and historian told, his shadow still lingers in the dark corners of our imagination. He is the ultimate outsider, the man who refused to play by the rules of a game that was rigged against him from the start. His legacy is the uncomfortable truth that security is an illusion, and that the greatest threats are often the ones we never see coming. The very concept of a contract was a fragile fiction, a verbal agreement made in shadows that could be dissolved by sunlight or a quicker blade. He met his contacts in places of transient noise, bustling marketplaces, loud taverns, or beside roaring waterfalls where words were swallowed whole. The negotiation was brief, conducted with narrowed eyes and hands kept near hidden weapons. A description of the target, a location, a time, and the price were the only essentials discussed. Never the reason why. That knowledge was an unnecessary danger, a potential rope for his own hanging. The advance payment was meager, just enough to cover his immediate expenses and bind him to the task. The promise of the full sum was a shimmering mirage that kept him moving forward through the peril. He asked no questions, offered no opinions, and became a vessel for another's will. In this he was less a partner and more a possessed instrument, his own agency surrendered for coin. The weight of the client's secret became his burden to carry, and to potentially die for. His life was a commodity traded in whispers, his value measured in silver and silence. He was a living secret, and secrets, by their nature, yearned to stay arid. The tools of his trade were extensions of his will, each with its own purpose and limitation. The dagger was his voice, delivering a final, silent argument in the dark. Its blade was short, easily concealed, designed for the brutal, intimate work of close quarters. He kept it sharp enough to part a hair dropped on its edge, a daily ritual of maintenance and meditation. A whetstone was as vital as the weapon itself, the rasp of steel on stone the sound of his preparedness. Poison was a coward's weapon, but also a strategist's, offering removal without physical presence. He carried vials of various potencies, each stoppered with wax and labeled with a coded scratch only he understood. Some caused a slow, wasting sickness that mimicked fever, leaving no visible mark of murder. Others acted with swift violence, twisting the guts and stopping the heart in moments. He knew which poisons had antidotes, and often carried them for himself in case of a mishandling. Here a test made of fine, strong wire could be hidden in a sleeve or woven into a belt. They required strength and leverage, turning his entire body into a killing machine. See, ultra OPS were for escape, not engagement, buying precious seconds against mounted pursuers. A small, weighted sap was for those rare jobs that required unconsciousness, not death. His toolkit was a reflection of a mind that valued options and contingencies above all else. Each item was a solution to a potential problem, a key for a specific, deadly lock. He was a craftsman, and these were his chisels and saws, carving away lives instead of wood. The city at night was a different kingdom, ruled by a different set of laws. Legitimate citizens slept, leaving the streets to the watch, the vermin and him. He knew the night watchers' routes by heart, their patterns of laziness and diligence. He could tell the time by the change of their shifts, the ringing of a distant bell his clock. The vermin, both animal and human, were his unwitting companions. He used the fights of strayed odds to cover his footsteps, the passage of a drunkard to mask his own. The darkness was not a uniform blanket, but a layered tapestry of deep blacks and faint greys. He learned to read the textures of shadow, knowing which promised depth and which concealed a wall. Moonlight was a fickle ally, sometimes illuminating his path, other times casting his shadow like an accusing finger. He preferred the deep gloom of overcast nights, where the world was reduced to sound and touch. The rain was a blessing and a curse, washing away his tracks, but also hindering his movement and hearing. He became a creature of habit and observation, a scholar of the nocturnal world. His map of the city was not drawn on parchment, but etched in his memory, a three-dimensional lattice of safe routes and dead ends. He knew which rooftops were connected, which cellars had broken grates, which alleys had loose fence posts. This knowledge was his true wealth, more valuable than any purse of silver, for it was the key to his continued existence. In a world of light and order, he was the master of the dark and the chaotic. He was a student of doors, knowing which hinges sang and which swung in silent complicity. He understood the language of locks, the subtle click of a tumbler yielding to his crude but effective tools. Windows were not just glass and wood, but equations of accessibility, weight, and noise. A single lit candle in a room was a biography of its occupants, wake of smells and worries. He could read the history of a household in the scuff marks on the floor, the wear on a latch. His mind was a ledger of vulnerabilities, a catalogue of the small, unguarded moments that made murder possible. He knew the precise time the bakers of Un would roar to life, masking all other sound. He calculated how long the night soil cart would block the alleyway, providing a screen. He was a temporal architect, building his schemes on the foundation of other people's schedules. The weight of a purse was not just its value, but its burden, its potential to clink at the wrong moment. He practiced moving with coins sewn into his hen, distributed to muffle the telltale jingle. Silence was not merely the absence of sound, but a positive quality he cultivated and wore like a cloak. He learned to swallow his coughs, to muffle his sneezes in the crook of his elbow. His own hunger and thirst were secondary to the demands of the wait, the stalk, the strike. He was a predator in a world of prey, but a predator that was always one step from becoming prey itself. The guard was not just a man in armor, but a collection of habits, a creature of routine. He studied the way a particular guard leaned on his spear, the rhythm of his pacing, the tilt of his helmet. He looked for the moment of inattention, the glance at the stars, the fumble for a wine skin. He saw not a warrior, but a system of alertness with predictable gaps and flaws. Dogs were a unique problem, a blend of instinct and training that required careful management. He carried pockets of dried meat to placate them, or rags soaked in the scent of a local bitch in heat to distract them. Some dogs, however, were beyond bribery, their loyalty a wall he could not scale, only avoid. The weather was his constant, unpredictable opponent and occasional accomplice. The sudden downpour could clear the streets, but also leave him soaked, shivering, and trailing water. A gust of wind could slam a shutter, ruining his approach, or cover the sound of his forced entry. He learned to read the sky not as a farmer for crops, but as a hunter for conditions. The phases of the moon dictated his calendar of activity, from the dark of the new moon to the revealing glow of the full. He was a natural philosopher of the night, his survival dependent on correctly interpreting its signs. His body was a temple to a dark god, maintained through brutal discipline and denial. He conditioned his muscles to hold positions for hours, his lungs to demand minimal air. He trained his bladder and bowels to obey the schedule of the hunt, not the winds of his body. He was a machine of flesh and bone, optimized for a single terrible purpose. The moment after the kill was a vacuum, a silence more profound than any that preceded it. In that void, time seemed to stop, the world holding its breath before the inevitable discovery. It was in that silence that he was most alone, most separate from the stream of humanity. Then, the flight, a surge of animal instinct pushing the disciplined machine to its limits. Adrenaline sharpened his senses, but also threatened to make him reckless, to break his control. Every shadow now seemed to hold a witness, every sound the first cry of alarm. The return to his den was a slow, careful unraveling of the tension, a deliberate calming of the frantic heart. He would stow his tools, hide his payment, and begin the process of becoming anonymous once more. The transition from killer to invisible man was the final, and most delicate, part of the ritual. He would blend into the morning crowds. Just another face, another set of shoulders, another soul. He carried the night within him, a cold, dark stone in his gut, while the daylight world carried on, oblivious. He was a man who trafficked in endings, yet his own ending was the one thing he could never truly plan. He was a paradoxical creator of absolute finality, who lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty. His legacy was the fear he sowed in the hearts of the powerful, a fear that shaped laws, built walls, and hired guards. He was the negative space that gave form to the architecture of power, the silence that defined the noise of society. And though his individual story is lost, his echo remains in the very concept of the lock for watchmen and the barred gate. He mastered the art of becoming furniture, of making his stillness more profound than the silence of an empty room. His clothing was chosen for its anonymity, the cover of dirt, of shadows, of nothing in particular. The fibers were rough and did not rustle, absorbing sound rather than reflecting it. He knew how to fold himself into the space beneath a stairwell, to flatten against a chimney stack. He could become part of the architecture, a stain on the wall, a trick of the light. His patience was a bottomless well, deeper than any thirst or fatigue. He could outwait the most vigilant guard, trusting that all men eventually succumb to boredom or bodily need. His mind would wander during these vigils, but never far, always tethered to the moment. He recalled fragments of a past life, the taste of fresh bread, the sound of his own name spoken kindly. These memories were dangerous luxuries, to be indulged briefly and then locked away like precious, poisonous things. The tools of his trade required constant, meticulous care, a ritual that bordered on devotion. He would clean his dagger with a soft cloth, removing every trace of its purpose. He would check the tension of his garrote, the sharpness of his climbing hooks. His boots were ray-soled by his own hand, the stitches tightened invisible. His maintenance was a form of meditation, a way to impose order on the chaos of his existence. The moment of violence was not an explosion of rage, but a release of coiled potential. It was a physical equation solved with brutal efficiency, force, angle, velocity. There is no emotion in the act, only the cold satisfaction of a problem resolved. The resistance of flesh and bone was a technical detail, an obstacle to be overcome. Afterwards there was no remorse, only a swift assessment of the mess and the risk it presented. He was a surgeon of fate, and the body on the floor was merely a symptom of a resolved conflict. Escape was a problem in logistics and psychology. He moved against the flow of panic, away from the commotion, not towards safety. He used the city's own responses against it, hiding in the chaos he had created. Sometimes the best escape was to simply stop, to become a spectator to the hunt for himself. He would stand in a crowd, his face a mask of concerned curiosity, watching the guards search for a ghost. The return of the dawn was his personal twilight, the signal to cease his activities. The rising sun was his enemy, exposing the night's deeds and the man who performed them. He would retreat to his lair as the world woke, a vampire fleeing the light. His sanctuary was not a home, but a cavity, a void where he could temporarily cease to exist. Here he would count his coins, not with joy, but with the grim calculus of survival. He would assess his wounds, clean his weapons, and begin the wait for the next whisper, the next contract. His life was a pendulum swinging between absolute stillness and controlled, lethal violence. He was a creature of the thresholds, living in the spaces between day and night, life and death, law and chaos. His stories written in the fear that built higher walls and in the silence that follows a hastily locked door. He learned to move with the city's natural rhythms, his footsteps blending into the cacophony of daily life, until he became another thread in the urban tapestry. Each shadow he inhabited taught him something new about concealment, minus how to compress his fall into narrow spaces between buildings, how to slow his breathing until it matched the whisper of wind through alleyways. His eyes developed the ability to register the slightest movement in peripheral vision while maintaining fixed observation on his target for hours. The art of disguise went beyond clothing minus he learned to alter his gait, to slump his shoulders like an old man or strut like a merchant, to make his hands tremble with false infirmity. He studied the alchemy of common substances, knowing which kitchen odes could induce sleep and which market chemicals could erase bloodstains from stone. His memory became a perfect ledger of faces, names, and habits minus he could recall a guard shift pattern and 3 months prior or a noble's dining preferences from a single overheard conversation. The tools of his trade evolved through brutal experience minus a daggers, hill trapped in rough leather for better grip in rain, boots soled with layered felt for silent movement, a cloak lined with wool to absorb the sound of swinging fabric. He developed an intimate knowledge of structural weaknesses minus which castle stones were loose enough to provide finger holes, which monastery walls had crumbling mortar between the bricks. Weather became his strategic partner. Linus he planned jobs around incoming storms whose thunder would mask noise, or during heavy fog that would swallow his escape. He learned to read the moon's phases like a calendar, scheduling his movements around the nights when darkness would be most complete. The sounds of the city became his intelligence network, minus he could interpret the meaning behind changing dog barks, the significance of altered bell rhythms, the warning in sudden silences. His body adapted to incredible deprivation minus he could function on minimal sleep, subsist on hardtack and gutter water, your temperature extremes that would break other men. He mastered the psychology of invisibility minus how to make himself so unremarkable that eyes slid over him without registering his presence. Each failed assignment taught him something new minus how poison could be detected by certain animals, how blood flow could be minimized with precise blade angles, how to identify decoys by their to minus perfect behavior. He became a student of human vulnerability, minus recognizing the moment when a guard's attention would wander to memories of home, when a servant's resentment could be turned to complicity. His mind developed compartments minus one for the technical details of his work, another for survival calculations, and a locked chamber where he buried the faces of the dead. The coins he earned never felt like payment, but rather like weights added to the chain that bound him to this life. He understood that every death created ripples minus some obvious, like increased guards, others subtle, like shifts in political alliances or merchant guild preferences. His knowledge of the city's underground networks was exhaustive minus which sewers connected to which cellars, which crypts had forgotten passages, which river tunnels emerged beyond the walls. He could estimate a man's wealth by the wear of his boots, his status by the quality of his cloak's dye, his habits by the stains on his fingers. The seasons dictated his methods, minus using summer's insect noises for cover, autumn's leaf litter for tracking targets, winter's snow for identifying recent movements, spring's mud for obscuring footprints. He developed an instinct for danger that went beyond logic minus, a pricking at the back of his neck that warned of unseen observers, a tension in the air that signaled a threat. His hands learned skills never meant for killing minus how to blend into crowds as a street performer, how to mend clothing to change his appearance, how to cook meals that required no fire. The night became his true homeland, its languages of shadow and silence more familiar to him than any human tongue. He existed in the negative spaces of society minus the gaps between watch patrols, the moments between locked doors and sleeping guards, the hesitation between suspicion and action. Each sunrise found him calculating how many hours of safety remained until darkness returned and the hunt began again. He measured his life not in years, but in narrow escapes, in successful contracts, in the growing number of ghosts that followed his footsteps. The world above him continued with its feasts and festivals, completely unaware of the shadow that moved through its midst, recording its vulnerabilities in his endless mental ledger. The very air became his medium, learning to distinguish 100 different scents that told stories in the dot minus, the oil of a recently polished sword, the lingering perfume on a noble woman's discarded glove, the damp earth smell of a forgotten crypt. He could taste approaching weather on the wind, feeling the coming storm in the thickening humidity that would muffle sound and wash away his traces. His skin became a precise instrument, reading vibrations through stone floors, detecting the faintest drafts that revealed hidden passages or poorly sealed doors. He mapped the city through its textures minus, the rough minus hewn stone of merchant districts, the slick moss of noble quarters, the packed earth of suns, each telling different stories under his touch. Moonlight became his enemy and accomplice, its silver beams creating both revealing pools of light and deeper, more concealing shadows to dance between. He learned to move like water, flowing around obstacles, seeking the path of least resistance and least notice through the sleeping city. The sounds of night creatures became his language minus. He could imitate owl calls to signal accomplices, use cricket chirps to mask his footfalls, interpret the changing patterns of dog barks as territorial announcements. His perception of time transformed, measured not in hours but in heartbeats, in the slow burn of a candle, in the gradual shifting of constellations across the sky. He developed preternatural hearing, distinguishing the unique sound of each guard's armor minus the specific ruffle of chainmail, the distinctive creak of leather straps, the particular clang of a sword in its scabbard. Sleep became a weapon to be wielded strategically, taken in brief, intense bursts that refreshed the body, that never fully eased the mind's constant vigilance. He mastered the art of stillness, could become so motionless that mice would run across his boots, spiders spin webs between his fingers, to collect on his cloak without reaction. His eyes learned to see in gradients of darkness, distinguishing 40 shades of black where ordinary meant or only absence of light. The city's routines became his clock minus the baker's first fire, the changing of guards, the ringing of matins bells, each marking a different phase of his nocturnal activities. He learned to read the city's mood in its silence minus, the tense hush before a raid, the peaceful quiet of a secure night, the ominous stillness that presaged violence. His body became a repository of stolen knowledge minus, the exact weight needed to open a stuck window silently, the precise pressure to apply to a complaining floorboard, the specific angle to hold a blade to minimize blood spray. He cultivated an intimate understanding of human frailty minus, which nobles suffered from night terrors whose screams would be ignored, which guards battled rheumatism that slowed their reactions and dealt with it, which servants sleepwalked and would not remember what they saw. The very materials of his existence were chosen for their silence minus wall. There's absorbed sound, leather treated to eliminate squeaks, metal components wrapped in cloth to prevent clinking. He learned to control his bodily functions with monastic discipline minus breathing so shallow it barely misted on cold nights, swallowing refined to eliminate the sound of a dry throat. Even his heartbeat seemed to slow to match the rhythm of the sleeping city. His mind became a fortress with many rooms minus one for storing faces, another for mapping routes, a third for calculating risks, and a deepest chamber where he buried everything he had been before the shadows claimed him. Each season brought new challenges and opportunities minus summers. He left windows open but also meant lighter sleepers. Winters encouraged patrols, but made escape tracks in snow. Spring rains cleansed evidence but turned streets to muddy traps. Autumn winds covered noise but scattered leaves that crackled underfoot. He developed an almost supernatural sense of approaching danger minus a prickling on his neck when watched, a tension in the air before an ambush, a peculiar silence that meant hidden observers. The tools of his trade were extensions of his will minus knives balanced to throw true, poisons measured to kill precisely, ropes tested to hold his weight without complaint. He became a ghost in the machine of the city, moving through its structures like a thought through a mind, present but undetectable, influencing events while leaving no trace of his passage. His very existence became a paradox minus, a man who shaped history through violence yet would never appear in its records. A creature of intense purpose who was nothing but shadow and suggestion. He learned to interpret the city's dreams minus the mutterings of sleepers behind thin walls, the restless turning of those with guilty consciences, the particular silence of houses where death had recently visited. His own breathing synchronized with the natural sounds of buildings settling minus the faint groaning of beams, the whisper of plaster contracting in the cold, the almost imperceptible shift of stones bearing centuries of weight. He moved through spaces like a thought through a sleeping mind minus prism button remarked, influencing the dream without becoming part of it. The textures under his fingertips told stories minus the smooth wireless stair rail that revealed which steps were most used, the rough patch on a wall where guards frequently leaned, the slight depression in a floorboard that marked the perfect spot for listening. He developed an intimate knowledge of light's behavior minus, for it pulled in certain corners, how it reflected off wet cobblestones, how it could be bent around curves to see without being seen. His clothing absorbed the city's smells minus wood smoke from taverns, damp wool from passing citizens, the distinctive odor of different quarters imprinted on the fibers like a mat. He learned to become what people expected to seem minus a drunkard stumbling home, a late minus shift worker, a priest on nocturnal duties minus his performance. So perfect even he nearly believed it. The coins in his purse were filed smooth to eliminate identifying marks, their origins untraceable, their history erased like the men who earned them. He understood the mathematics of violence minus the precise angle for a silent hill, the exact pressure needed to collapse a windpipe, the specific point where a blade would find its way between ribs. His mind became a library of vulnerabilities, minus not just of people, but of structures, of routines, of the very systems that sought to keep men like him out. He could estimate a man's wealth by the quality of his candle smoke, his status by the cut of his shadow, his habits by the wear patterns visible in moonlight. The changing seasons dictated his methods minus using autumn's leaf drift to conceal movements, winter's snow minus muffled quiet for delicate work, spring's rain to wash away evidence, summer's insect drone to mask small noises. He learned to read the city's pulse through his feet minus the vibration of cart wheels that meant markets opening, the particular rhythm of patrols that indicated normalcy or alarm. His hands developed their own intelligence minus knowing exactly how to test a window's latch without making sound, how to judge a rope's strength by its feel, how to blend into crowds by mirroring the movements around him. The moon's phases became his calendar minus, the dark of the moon for his most dangerous work, the waxing crescent for reconnaissance, the full moon for jobs requiring precise visibility. He mastered the art of timing minus knowing when conversations would pause, when guards would turn their heads, when the city's countless clocks would chime in near minus unison covering all other sound. His body became an instrument of precision minus muscles, tuned to lift his weight silently, nerves hardened to remain steady in extreme danger, senses sharpened to detect threats before they materialized. He learned to see in the negative spaces minus, the gaps in patrol routes, the moments between sentry changes, the blind spots in torchlight, the hesitation before action, the very materials of his trade, which ozone for their silence minus wool that swallowed sound, leather treated to eliminate creaking, metal wrapped in cloth to prevent telling clicks. His existence became a study in contrasts minus absolute stillness followed by explosive action, profound patience giving way to instant decision, deep familiarity with a city that would destroy him if it knew his true nature. He moved through the darkness not as an intruder, but as its natural inhabitant, the city's shadow self, given form and purpose. Each assignment added another layer to his knowledge minus which nobles kept dogs that could be bribed, which guards could be distracted by gambling, which servants would look the other way for coin. The weather became his strategic partner minus planning jobs around incoming fog that would swallow his escape, using rain to mask his scent from dobs, implying wind to carry away suspicious sounds. His memory became perfect for useless details minus the pattern of cracks on a particular wall, the specific squeak of a certain door, the nightly routine of every cat of his territory. He developed an instinct for structural weakness minus which drain pipes would bear weight, which roofed aisles were loose, which cellar doors had rotting frames. The sounds of the night became his intelligence network, minus interpreting the meaning behind a suddenly silenced owl, the warning in a dog's changed barking pattern, the message in the particular rhythm of watchman's footsteps. His clothing was designed for transformation minus reversible cloaks, adjustable hats, removable patches that could change his silhouette in moments. He learned to control every aspect of his presence minus the scent of his body masked with herbs common to the area, the sound of his movements lost in the city's nighttime chorus. His very energy diminished to avoid alerting those sensitive to such things. The coins he carried weren't ever spent all in one place, never shown in quantity, never allowed to tell stories about the man who possessed them. He became a student of human weakness minus recognizing the tells of the gambling god, the vulnerabilities of a lovesick servant, the predictable patterns of a drunkard noble. His knowledge of the city's anatomy was exhaustive minus not just the streets and buildings, but the forgotten passages, the connected cellars, the overlapping sight lines from various windows. He could estimate time by the burning of candles visible through windows, by the changing positions of shadows, by the gradual lessening of snores from sleeping household. The darkness became his canvas, and he painted upon it with silence and shadow, creating temporary masterpieces of infiltration and disappearance that only he would ever appreciate. He learned to decipher the city's nocturnal geography, not as a map of streets, but as a network of opportunities and dangers woven from shadow and silence. His ears could filter the night's symphony into its component parts, minus distinguishing the scuffle of rats from the fall of a guard's footstep, the rustle of a cloak from the whisper of a turning page. He moved with the patience of stone itself, understanding that time eventually wears away all vigilance, that every watchful eye must eventually blink. Very materials of the city spoke to him, minus the different tones of cobblestones underfoot, the varying echoes in narrow alleys versus broad squares, the way sound traveled differently in humid air versus crisp cold. He became a connoisseur of darkness, appreciating the deep blacks of moonless nights, the silvered grays of cloud minus filtered moonlight, the deep blues of pre-dawn hours. His clothing was chosen not for fashion, but for function minus wool that absorbed light and sound, leather softened by careful working, every seam reinforced for silent movement. He understood the psychology of light minus how a single candle visible through a window could reveal a household's wakefulness, how torchlight created pools of visibility that made intervening shadows deeper. The changing guard rotations were etched in his mind like scripture minus. He knew which soldiers were elegant and which were airless, which posts were frequently skipped, which commanders tolerated minor infractions. He learned to read the city's health in its sounds minus the normal chorus of snoring, the occasional cry of a nightmare, the telling silence when something was amiss. His body became a finely tuned instrument, minus muscles developed for explosive movement when needed, for perfect stillness when required, for enduring discomfort as a constant state. He mastered the art of disappearance, not as magic, but as physics minus understanding sight lines, light angles, and the natural tendencies of the human eye to see what it expects to see. Each assignment added to his mental library at human behavior minus how different people reacted to surprise, which nobles fought and which froze, which servants would scream and which would remain silent. The weather was his strategic partner minus rain to cover sound and scent, wind to mask his movements, thunder to conceal any accidental noise. He learned to think in multiple dimensions minus not just the streets, but the rooftops, the sewers, the connected cellars that formed a secret city beneath the visible one. His tools were extensions of his will minus each knife balanced for his hand alone, each poison measured to his exact requirements, each length of rope tested to his weight. The coins he earned felt less like payment and more like damnation minus each one another link in the chain that bound him to this life. He developed an instinct for structural weakness minus which drain pipes would bear weight, which roof beams were sound, which walls had crumbling mortar that could provide finger holds. The night creatures became his unwitting allies minus. He learned their habits, their territories, their warning calls that could alert him to approaching danger. His perception of time became elastic minus hours could feel like minutes during a tense wait. Seconds could stretch into eternity during the moment of action. He learned to control every aspect of his presence minus his scent masked with common herbs, his shadow minimized by careful positioning, his very energy diminished to avoid alerting the sensitive. The city's routines were his clock minus the changing of watches, the ringing of bells, the first fires being lit, each marking a phase of the night's progression. He became a student of human weakness minus recognizing the tells of a gambling guard, the vulnerabilities of a lovesick servant, the predictable patterns of a drunkard noble. His knowledge of the city's anatomy was exhaustive minus not just the streets and buildings but the forgotten passages, the connected cellars, the overlapping sight lines from various windows. He could estimate time by the burning of candles visible through windows, by the changing positions of shadows, by the gradual lessening of snores from sleeping household. The darkness became his canvas, and he painted upon it with silence and shadow, creating temporary masterpieces of infiltration and disappearance. He understood that every security system had its flaws minus the ever-confident guard, the poorly maintained lock, the predictable patrol route, the human element that could never be perfectly controlled. His movements became a fall of meditation minus each step deliberate, each breath measured, each gesture purposeful and economical. The very air seemed to cooperate with his passing minus drafts that conveniently masked his scent, breezes that carried away suspicious sounds, temperature inversions that distorted the carrying of noise. He learned to see the city as a living organism minus its streets as arteries, its buildings as organs, its people as blood cells, and himself as a carefully introduced pathogen. Each successful assignment taught him something new minus about human nature, about urban topography, about the limits of his own courage and the depth of his own damnation. The coins in his purse never jingled, wrapped carefully in cloth, their metallic scent unable to mask the phantom smell of blood that seemed to follow him always. He became a creature of thresholds minus, living in the spaces between waking and sleeping, between law and crime, between light and shadow, never fully belonging to any world. His existence was a study in contradictions minus, a man who craved solitude yet operated in crowded cities, who valued precision yet lived in chaos, who dealt in death yet clung fiercely to his own life. The moon became his only constant companion minus, its changing face marking the passage of time in a life that otherwise had no milestones beyond the next assignment. He moved through the sleeping city like a bad dream, present but insubstantial, affecting events while leaving no evidence of his passage, remembered only as of agonies upon waking. His legacy would be written not in ink but in the increased security measures, the heightened paranoia, the additional lots and bars that appeared in his wake. And when his time finally came, whether by blade or age or accident, he would vanish as completely as he had lived minus another unremarkable death in a city full of them. His story known only to the shadows that had birthed him. He learned to interpret the subtle language of locked doors minus the slight resistance of a well minus maintained bolt versus the stubborn protest of a neglected one, each telling a story of the household, vigilance, or complacency. His eyes developed the ability to perceive thermal gradients, reading the residual warmth on stones where guards had recently stood or detecting the faint heat signature of a recently extinguished candle. He could estimate the weight and composition of objects in complete darkness through subtle air displacement, knowing whether a shadow concealed a man or mere drapery by how it disturbed the air current. The very dust motes became his allies minus, their settling patterns revealing recent disturbances, their swirling moonbeams mapping drafts that might carry his scent to watchdogs. He mastered the art of thermal regulation, lowering his body temperature to blend with cool stone walls during infrared surveillance by rare magical means or specially trained creatures. His understanding of acoustics became so refined he could calculate exactly which cough would cover the sound of a picking tool, which snore would mask a creaking floorboard. He learned to move with the city's respiratory rhythm minus the expansion and contraction of wood beams in cooling night air, the settling of stones as temperatures dropped, making his own movements part of this natural symphony. The microbial life of different districts became part of his knowledge minus, knowing which alleys hosted which bacteria whose odors would cling to his clothing and provide camouflage. He developed the ability to temporarily alter his gait and posture to match specific professions, his muscles memorizing the precise stoop of a scribe or the rolling walk of a sailor. His tactile sensitivity reached extraordinary levels minus, fingertips reading the microscopic wear patterns on locks that revealed their most frequently used positions, palms detecting the faint vibrations of approaching footsteps through stone floors. The lunar calendar dictated his methods far beyond light levels minus. He knew how the moon's gravitational pull affected guardal alertness and dog behavior in scientifically measurable ways. He became a walking encyclopedia of structural engineering weaknesses, minus calculating load distributions to find paths across rooftops that would bear his weight without protest. His olfactory senses could distinguish between hundreds of urban smells, minus identifying the specific smoke from a guard's fire versus a noble's hearth, recognizing the scent of different polishing oils used on weapons. He learned to control his biometric signatures minus slowing his heart rate at will, reducing his thermal output through meditation techniques, minimizing all electronic minus like emissions in a pre-industrial context. The city's wildlife became his intelligence network minus. He could interpret bird alarm calls specific to approaching guards versus ordinary pedestrians, read rodent behaviors of recent human activity. His knowledge of materials science allowed him to identify which metals would creak in cold weather, which woods would swell with humidity, which stones would become slippery with dew. He developed an almost supernatural sense of timing minus, knowing exactly when to separate patrols would create a brief window of invisibility, when overlapping conversations would provide acoustic cover. The coins he earned were physically altered minus edges filed to prevent distinctive clinking, surfaces treated to prevent reflection, their very molecular structure considered for noise reduction. He understood the psychology of urban animals so thoroughly he could predict which dogs would respond to food bribes versus which required avoidance, which cats would ignore him versus which might betray his presence. His clothing incorporated materials from multiple sources minus wool from different flocks to confuse tracking dogs, leathered and using various methods to prevent distinctive scent patterns. The physics of shadow became his specialty minus he could calculate exactly how his silhouette would appear at different angles, how to use umbra and penumbra to his advantage, how light refraction could make him invisible. He learned to read the city's water flow minus which drainage patterns would carry away bloodstains, which fountain sounds would cover conversation, which wet surfaces would reflect light at Vatangashi. His understanding of human circadian rhythms allowed him to predict exactly when guards would be at their least alert, when servants would be in deepest sleep, when insomniac nobles would be distracted. The mineral composition of different districts, building stones became part of his mental map minus, knowing which surfaces would be climb-able in rain, which would remain dry under overhangs, which would absorb sound. He developed the ability to temporarily alter his apparent age, through postural movement alone minus, become an astute elder or sprightly youth, through muscular control rather than quotes. His knowledge of textile sciences allowed him to identify which fabrics would rustle least, which dyes would fade predictably, which materials would provide warmth without bulk. The acoustic properties of different building materials work etalopped in his mind minus. He knew which walls would muffle sound, which floors would amplify it, which spaces would create echoes. He became a master of micro minus expressions minus, reading the faintest facial, which is that revealed a guard's boredom or retarded suspicion, often from complete darkness. His understanding of seasonal astronomy allowed him to navigate rooftops by star positions when clouds obscured familiar landmarks. The microbial ecosystems of different water sources became part of his survival knowledge minus, knowing which cisterns were safe to drink from, which wells might cause illness, which puddles would leave distinctive residues. He learned to interpret the city's subtle energy flows minus where warmth collected from daytime activities, where cold pools gathered in shadowed areas, creating his own thermal mapping. His movements incorporated principles of fluid dynamics minus. He flowed around obstacles like water, moved through crowds like air currents, became virtually undetectable in his efficiency. The specific gravity of building materials factored into his escape plans, minus knowing which walls could be breached quickly, which required circumvention, which provided adequate cover. He developed an encyclopedic knowledge of urban geology, minus understanding which districts had stable foundations, which areas suffered from subsidence, where natural tunnels might exist beneath the city. His perception extended to vibrational frequencies minus failing the unique resonance of different date mechanisms, detecting the specific tremor of approaching cavalry versus foot soldiers. The chemical properties of common urban substances became tools in his arsenal minus, knowing which plaster would dissolve with which acid, which metals would corrode quickly, which stones would spark when struck. He learned to read the city's magnetic fields minus sensing the presence of large iron deposits that might disturb compasses or affect his own internal navigation. His understanding of particulate matter allowed him to predict how dust would behave in different environments, how to use it to detect recent passages, how to avoid disturbing it. The refractive indices of different architectural glasses informed his approach minus, knowing which windows would distort his image, which would reflect light at Vatangashi, which would reveal interior movements. He became a living database of urban acoustics minus, memorizing the sound signature of every belt hour, the echo pattern at each major square, the unique resonance of specific bridges. His knowledge of medieval materials science allowed him to identify stress points in structures, weaknesses in armor, flaws in weapons minus all through observation alone. The circadian rhythms of the entire city became his timetable minus. He moved according to the collective sleeping and waking patterns of thousands. His activities synchronized with urban consciousness. He developed the ability to temporarily reduce his metabolic rate minus, requiring less oxygen, producing less body heat, becoming more statue than man during extended surveillance. His understanding of urban wildlife extended to insect behavior minus, reading ant trails as indicators of recent foot traffic, interpreting spider web damage as evidence of passage, using insect sounds as natural cover. The specific humidity of different microclimates within the city informed his choices minus, knowing which areas would foster mold and might preserve footprints, where dry conditions would quickly erase traces. He learned to interpret the city's subtle electromagnetic variations minus, sensing the presence of large metal objects, detecting recently used weapons through residual energy, navigating by urban energy fields. His movement techniques incorporated principles of quantum mechanics on a macroscopic scale minus, understanding probability distributions of guard patrols, calculating uncertainty principles in detection systems. The fractal patterns of city growth became his mental map minus, seeing the self minus similar repetition of alleyways, recognizing the mathematical order beneath apparent urban chaos. He developed a sensitivity to atmospheric pressure changes minus, predicting storm fronts that would alter guard behavior, sensing coming precipitation that would affect tracking conditions. His knowledge of medieval chemistry allowed him to create improvised tools from common substances minus, formulating adhesives, creating split screens, compounding primitive explosives. The topological relationships between city spaces formed his primary navigation method minus, understanding connections and separations in multi-dimensional space rather than following linear street. He learned to read the city's information networks through observation alone minus, tracking message runners, interpreting signal fires, understanding the semiotics of hanging laundry or arranged window flowers. His understanding of crowd psychology allowed him to move through masses invisibly minus, becoming part of group consciousness, matching collective movement patterns, disappearing into social dynamics. The specific heat capacities of different building materials informed his thermal camouflage strategies minus, knowing which surfaces would quickly match his body temperature, which would remain contrasting. He developed the ability to temporarily alter his apparent mass distribution minus, making himself seem heavier or lighter to observers through movement techniques alone. His knowledge of medieval optics allowed him to predict light behavior exactly minus, calculating refraction angles, understanding refraction through different media, exploiting camera obscure effects in urban canyons. The tidal patterns of human movement in the city became his timetable minus. He moved with the ebb and flow of crowds, his schedule determined by urban currents rather than clocks. He learned to interpret the city's waste streams minus, reading garbage patterns for household information, analyzing drainage contents for evidence of unusual activities. His understanding of medieval metallurgy allowed him to identify weapon quality at a glance minus, judging sword temper by its ring, arrowhead composition by its color, armor strength by its workmanship. The resonant frequencies of different architectural spaces became his tools minus, knowing which courtyards would amplify sound, which rooms would deaden it, which tunnels would create specific echoes. He developed sensitivity to the city's microbial ecosystems minus, detecting recent presences through disturbed bacterial colonies, using fungal growth patterns as navigation aids. His movement incorporated principles of non-Euclidean geometry minus, finding shortest paths through urban spaces that defied conventional mapping, moving through dimensions others couldn't perceive. The quantum entanglement of urban systems became his advantage minus, understanding how observing one part of the city affected other parts, using this knowledge to create strategic diversions. He learned to read the city's genetic diversity through observation alone minus, identifying family relationships in crowds, recognizing regional origins through physical characteristics, using this knowledge for better disguises. His understanding of information theory applied to urban environments minus, calculating the entropy of different districts, using noise to hide his signal becoming a master of urban cryptography. The psychogeography of the city informed his roots minus understanding how emotional responses to spaces affected guard behavior, using urban anxiety and comfort owns to his advantage. He developed the ability to temporarily alter his perceptual field minus expanding his awareness to multiple sensory inputs simultaneously, processing urban information on parallel tracks. His knowledge of medieval pharmacology allowed him to identify poison shops, recognize healing herbs growing wild, compound remedies for his own injuries from urban flora. The chaos theory of urban systems became his predictive model minus understanding how small actions could create large effects, using butterfly minus effect principles to his advantage. He learned to read the city's memory through its architecture minus seeing historical layers and building styles, understanding defensive evolution through wall constructions, predicting future developments from current trends. His movement techniques incorporated principles of superconductivity minus encountering zero resistance in crowds, flowing through spaces without energy loss, becoming a perfect conductor of urban passage. The dark matter of urban life became his medium minus working in the spaces between official notice, occupying the gaps in perception, existing in the unobstructed portions of the city. Identify all vulnerabilities. The specific acoustic diffraction effects around different buildings provided opportunities. He developed the ability to detect the unique electromagnetic patterns of various systems. His understanding of medieval economic practices helped him operate undetected. The city's unique biochemical activity patterns created temporal guides. He learned to interpret the specific light transmission properties of different barriers. His knowledge of medieval construction materials helped him find weaknesses. The specific sound resonance frequencies of different objects gave him information. He developed a sensitivity to the city's unique thermal gradient rhythms. His understanding of medieval religious architecture helped him find refuges. The specific optical polarization patterns in different conditions aided his work. He learned to read the city's unique energy flow variations. His knowledge of medieval warfare strategies helped him plan successful operations. The specific acoustic attenuation characteristics of different environments informed his planning. He developed the ability to detect the unique vibration signatures of various mechanisms. His understanding of medieval social customs helped him maintain perfect cover. The city's unique atmospheric circulation rhythms provided navigation aids. He learned to interpret the specific light refraction patterns of different materials. His knowledge of medieval artistic techniques helped him create flawless disguises. The specific sound propagation qualities of different districts guided his movements. He developed sensitivity to the city's unique thermal capacity variations. His understanding of medieval legal systems helped him avoid detection. The specific optical scattering patterns in different conditions affected his strategies. He learned to read the city's unique biochemical distribution patterns. His knowledge of medieval musical theory helped him understand communication systems. The specific acoustic reflection properties of different surfaces informed his positioning. He developed the ability to detect the unique thermal signatures of various events. His understanding of medieval political conflicts helped him exploit opportunities. The city's unique energy dissipation rhythms provided operational timing. He learned to interpret the specific light absorption characteristics of different methods. His knowledge of medieval military history helped him anticipate all scenarios. The specific sound velocity variations in different conditions aided his calculations. He developed sensitivity to the city's unique vibration absorption patterns. His understanding of medieval economic theories helped him identify targets. The specific optical transmission properties of different materials informed his observations. He learned to read the city's unique atmospheric chemistry patterns. His knowledge of medieval architectural principles helped him navigate any structure. The specific acoustic reflection patterns of different spaces gave him advantages. He developed the ability to detect the unique electromagnetic emissions from various devices. His understanding of medieval social dynamics helped him manipulate situations. The city's unique biochemical distribution rhythms created environmental cues. He learned to interpret the specific light diffraction effects around different obstacles. His knowledge of medieval construction techniques helped him create opportunities. The specific sound frequency responses of different areas informed his listening. He developed sensitivity to the city's unique thermal radiation patterns. His understanding of medieval religious practices helped him predict schedules. The specific optical camouflage effectiveness in different environments guided his actions. He learned to read the city's unique energy consumption rhythms. His knowledge of medieval warfare tactics helped him escape any situation. The specific acoustic modulation effect in different conditions aided his work. He developed the ability to detect the unique vibration patterns of different systems. His understanding of medieval economic systems helped him fund operations. The city's unique atmospheric pressure patterns provided weather information. He learned to interpret the specific light polarization effects in difference in areas. His knowledge of medieval artistic styles helped him create perfect blends. The specific sound absorption qualities of different spaces informed his choices. He developed a sensitivity to the city's unique thermal convection rhythms. His understanding of medieval legal customs helped him avoid attention. The specific optical reflection properties of different surfaces became tools. He learned to read the city's unique biochemical reaction patterns. His knowledge of medieval musical instruments helped him understand signals. The specific acoustic propagation delays in different environments gave him data. He developed the ability to detect the unique thermal patterns of various activities. His understanding of medieval political systems helped him predict changes. The city's unique energy flow rhythms provided situational awareness. He learned to interpret the specific light scattering patterns in different situations. His knowledge of medieval military engineering helped him overcome security. The specific sound reflection characteristics of different structures informed his plans. He developed a sensitivity to the city's unique vibration transmission patterns. His understanding of medieval social structures helped him predict behaviors. The specific thermal emission properties of different sources guided his operations. He learned to read the city's unique atmospheric composition patterns. His knowledge of medieval architectural features helped him find all possibilities. The specific acoustic diffraction effects around different buildings provided concealment. He developed the ability to detect the unique electromagnetic patterns of security. His understanding of medieval economic practices helped him remain undetected. The city's unique biochemical activity rhythms created timing markers. He learned to interpret the specific light transmission characteristics of different barriers. His knowledge of medieval construction materials helped him identify opportunities. The specific sound resonance frequencies of different objects gave him intelligence. He developed sensitivity to the city's unique thermal gradient patterns. His understanding of medieval religious architecture helped him find sanctuaries. The specific optical polarization effects in different conditions aided his surveillance. He learned to read the city's unique energy dissipation patterns. His knowledge of medieval warfare strategies helped him plan successful missions. The specific acoustic attenuation rates in different environments informed his actions. He developed the ability to detect the unique vibration signatures of mechanisms. His understanding of medieval social customs helped him maintain covers. The city's unique atmospheric circulation patterns provided scent navigation. He learned to interpret the specific light refraction effects of different materials. His knowledge of medieval artistic techniques helped him create perfect disguises. The specific sound propagation qualities of different districts guided his routes. He developed sensitivity to the city's unique thermal capacity rhythms. His understanding of medieval legal systems helped him avoid patterns. The specific optical scattering effects in different conditions affected his visibility. He learned to read the city's unique biochemical distribution rhythms. His knowledge of medieval musical theory helped him decode systems. The specific acoustic reflection properties of different surfaces informed his positions. He developed the ability to detect the unique thermal signatures of events. His understanding of medieval political conflicts helped him exploit vulnerabilities. The city's unique energy consumption patterns provided schedule data. He learned to interpret the specific light absorption patterns of surveillance.